As crowds of protesters breached security checkpoints in and around the Capitol building, questions remain about the preparedness and response of law enforcement. Here's video from yesterday of a police officer retreating from a crowd of protesters up a set of stairs inside the Capitol. The president himself tweeted last month, "Big protest in D.C. on January 6th. Be there, will be wild." For more on this, I'm joined by CBS News reporter Nicole Sganga. Hi there, Nicole. You were out there in the middle of that, covering the riots all day and into the morning hours. What did you see, and can you compare it to what you saw when you covered the Black Lives Matter protests back in June?
Different scenes. On June 1st of last year, those images seared into our mind of law enforcement preemptively firing tear gas, deploying flashbangs, and using force to disperse peaceful protesters in Lafayette Park near the White House ahead of the president's remarks following the death of George Floyd. In police custody, there were officials from the National Guard, Bureau of Prison, Customs and Border Patrol, law enforcement on hand, already staged outside the White House. And what we saw yesterday was a law enforcement response from federal bureaucracy that was hesitant, even as rioters climbed the walls of the U.S. Capitol and physically broke into the building using brute force to overthrow barricades, many of them looting the legislative building. And agencies with law enforcement arms waited around, waiting to be asked to be sent in. Perhaps most telling, I spoke about that June 1st demonstration outside the White House. There were physical walls, fencing, barriers that had already been in place protecting the White House during those Black Lives Matter protests. Only today, Ken Cuccinelli, the second highest ranking DHS official, visited the Capitol to assess the damage and announced that DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, would install security fencing around the Capitol at the request of the Capitol Police with money from the Department of the Army. So only today was the decision made to put fencing, physical barricades around the Capitol, even though law enforcement agencies knew that these protesters, these rioters, this was coming to Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and Nicole, this protest was expected because of the Electoral College vote count. It was not the first time a legislature was stormed. In fact, it happened just 2 weeks ago in Oregon. What military and law enforcement assets were in place and at the ready ahead of time?
Well, I spoke with the National Park Service, which handles the permits for some of these massive demonstrations that come to Washington, D.C. We should note that Washington is a city that is used to responding to protests. What we saw, of course, surpassed that of previous protests we have seen with the rioting and the looting and the insurrection at the Capitol building. But the permit actually changed Monday night from the National Park Service. Their expected turnout went from 5,000 individuals to 30,000 individuals. And so they knew that at least tens of thousands of people were going to descend on the Ellipse, on the National Mall, on Wednesday. Now, Park Police were in place, Capitol Police were in place, Metropolitan Police were in place, but the Capitol Police, that's a law enforcement agency that is 2,300 strong. And we did not see close to that many officers at the scene. Initially, there were Capitol Police officers and MPD on the ground. They requested the backup of several federal agencies, including the U.S. Secret Service. But what we saw was a slow trickle in of some of these law enforcement agencies. DHS requested 50 CBP officers assist the Federal Protective Services around 3 p.m. A defense official told David Martin, our Pentagon correspondent, today that days ago, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser had asked Guard troops to be at the Capitol, but the Pentagon resisted this request. They didn't want it to look like military involvement in the political process, and they negotiated an agreement that was around 340 troops, mainly for traffic control in the nation's capital. Well, today, after the scenes that played out yesterday, there are 6,200 National Guard from D.C., New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia that will remain activated through the inauguration and in its aftermath, so this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, so many questions
Yes.
about why, though, assets couldn't have been pre-positioned ahead of time. Well, what do we know about the organizations and individuals who engaged in the riots?
Yeah, we were there very early on the ground at 3:30 a.m. around the ellipse ahead of the president's remarks to his supporters there. We spotted several militia and right-wing groups. They included the Oath Keepers, the Sons of Liberty, members of the Proud Boys that we noticed who were dispersed throughout the crowd. We also saw dozens of QAnon flags, signs, T-shirts. Of course, we know QAnon, this conspiracy group, that the president that has shown its support for the president. We often see these kinds of groups at the president's rallies, but they were out in full force on the National Mall. People toting weapons, people who were showing aggression, who were wearing combat and tactical gear, camouflage, baseball bats. At one point, my own crew and I went into the TV satellite truck because a man wielding a baseball bat had approached us. So there were folks who were, clearly showing signs of aggression. In addition to that, Elaine, we should point out that the vast majority of people we saw descending on the Capitol were not wearing masks. We shouldn't forget we are still amid a pandemic here, and we just saw throngs of people at the U.S. Capitol, approaching law enforcement agents. We saw this scene play out. No one, I shouldn't say no one, but about 4 out of 5 people that we saw were not wearing any sort of PPE. And so there are, of course, concerns that this could become a super spreader event on top of all of the destruction we witnessed yesterday.
All right, Nicole Sganga. Nicole, I cannot imagine what that must have been like for you and your team. I'm so glad that you are safe. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.